Thank you for having me. So my presentation is very visual. If you want to look at the images yourself on your computer, I'll give you like 10 seconds to type that in. It's 1n.pm/w uppercase NIO lowercase w. So I'll give you 10 seconds to do that while I stand here and stare at you. Cool. So my name is Bashir Mohamed. So I wasn't born here. I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, to Somali refugees. And we landed in Edmonton in February 12, 1997. It was the first time I saw snow, and my sister actually convinced me that snow was sugar. So I put it in my backpack and it all melted. And that was my first experience with Edmonton. I grew up here. I did all my schooling. Oh, that's my sister in the back, and that's me in the front. And this is Dickensfield on the north side. So I did all my schooling here, elementary to university. I graduated from the U of A in 2017. I spent 2 years working in the province. I left the provincial government September 6th, so it's pretty recent. And now I'm just doing writing and research full time. So growing up here, I always felt that Edmonton was my home. It's the only place I really knew and really understood. And it was, growing up, it was challenged a few times, but I guess one moment that really challenged me and actually got me interested in research in Alberta's history was in 2016. I was riding my bike down 104 right by the arena, and it was still under construction. And I was taking the lane because it was one lane, and I hit a red light, and these people in an SUV got really mad at me, and one of them got out of the car and said, "Get off the road, you N-word." And I filmed like the aftermath of it. As you could tell, they were really mad at me, and it blew up. I don't know if you, and this was about a month before another incident happened that launched, that person used it to launch this whole make it awkward thing. But a month before that, this happened, and it started a conversation. A lot of people were talking about how this is not Edmonton, this is not the Canada I know, this was one incident, it's isolated, we're not the States. And I wondered if that was true. So I decided, then I was a student, so I decided to see if that was true. I'm going to show you 5 or 6 images. They're images of Edmonton, and each one has to do with Edmonton's Black history and civil rights history. So this is downtown Edmonton. On the right is the Macleod Building, and on the left is the Westin. This is the old Enbridge Building on Jasper. You may have walked by it. This is the new Enbridge Building, and you can see there's 2 historic buildings built into it. This is Gibson Block. It's a Flatiron building. I'll talk about that building in a bit. Does anyone know where this is? Borden Park. And University of Alberta. This is Pembina Hall. So when people start talking about Alberta's Black history, they usually start with John Ware. He was a black cowboy. But one early Black Albertan, black immigrant to Alberta, I find really interesting is Henry Mills. He was born to slavery, moved into modern-day Montana in 1830, and he moved into Alberta as a whiskey trader in 1870. And this is kind of the path he took to get into Alberta. And while in southern Alberta, he actually married into the blood tribe and he actually learned Blackfoot. And people would come across him. So this is an example. In 1873, at the later site of Calgary, a traveler at the time commented that the interpreter was a Negro. I was told that the Negroes master the Indian language more quickly and easily than the white man. So he had a son that was half black, half blood, and he also became an interpreter. He married again into a blood tribe, and he worked as an interpreter until he died of old age in 1918. So that's Dave Mills in the back, right? This is his son, Dave Jr. His son would go to fight in World War I, and he passed away in 1918, a month after his father passed away. And this is his other son. Sorry, I have a slight stutter sometimes, but this is his other son. John Ware, the famous cowboy. Similar story, born to slavery in Southern Carolina, moved to Western US to learn how to be a rancher, one of the first to introduce cattle into Southern Alberta, and he popularized steer wrestling, and actually was a major influence for the Calgary Stampede. steer wrestling, some more photos of John Ware. And the government, to honor him, they named a ridge after him. And back then, Black people across Canada and North America were often not referred to by their full name. They were often referred to by the N-word and then their first name. So this ridge was named after him, called Nigger John Ridge. And this name lasted until 1970, when it was finally changed. And this is not an isolated case. If you look, there's a lot of geographical locations in Canada that had this racial slur. A lot of them often refer to Black people or involved something involving a Black person. For example, the rapids that are mentioned involve a Black couple that drowned. But instead of referring to the rapids as their name, they use the slur. So these are all rescinded, but these are all still official. I guess maybe because this is a little less offensive. But as you can see, there's places in Nova Scotia, BC, New Brunswick, Ontario, Newfoundland and Labrador. And there's also these ones. It's kind of funny. A lot of these places now will try to change the history and say, no, these are popular raccoon hunting spots. But if you if you look at some of these cases, you can see they're named after a Black person. So how many people here went to high school in Alberta? So you did the Cadillac Ranch, right? So I had to do that too. And when you think of cowboys, you usually get this image. In fact, I just literally Googled cowboys and I got this image. But you know that's not true when you think of people like John Ware. In fact, in North America, about 1/4 of cowboys are actually Black. So instead of this image, we should also be seeing images like this, and this. So those were a lot of early Black Albertans. The largest wave came in the early 1900s. They were fleeing the Jim Crow laws in the United States. And they came thousands, and they settled in rural Alberta. Some settled in Edmonton and some settled in Calgary, but a large amount of them formed all Black settlements in rural Alberta. So growing up in Alberta, learning the history, seeing images like this really changed my view of the province and how I saw myself as belonging. So these are photos of the early Black settlers who came into Alberta. And this is a map of some of the settlements. So you have Amber Valley, you have Campsie, you have Wildwood. And so they farmed on those settlements, but eventually a lot of them moved out and came into Edmonton and Calgary. Calgary had a large Black community. In fact, there's a neighborhood called Harlem in Calgary. I'll talk about that a bit later. And in Edmonton, a lot of the Black community was on the east side. But when they came here, they faced a lot of opposition. Petitions were organized opposing Black immigration. They were signed by city council. They were signed by labor organizations. And one argument against having Black people come here was that Black men were a danger to white women. So this is from the Edmonton Bulletin. Woman utters protests against Negro invasion. Dr. Ellis Inge makes appeal for all women. Province is powerless to stem dark tide, declares one minister. So she says, I should like to register a protest against the short-sighted policy of the government in permitting so large a body of Negroes to take up land in Alberta. Surely the result of Lord Gladstone's foolishness in South Africa is apparent enough already in the enormous increase of outrages on white women that has occurred since this reprieve of a Negro for a crime. And I see the finger of fate pointing to lynch law, written large in the North Country, she continued, which will be the ultimate result as sure as we allow such people to settle among us. In addition, Isabel Graham, who's the women's editor of The Guide, wrote, Fireside would like to know what the people think about the Negro invasion that is now pouring into the Canadian West and farming large settlements contiguous to and among the whites. There can scarcely be anyone who is not aware of the atrocities committed by members of these terrible communities, the only corresponding punishment for which is the lawless lynching. Already it is reported that 3 white women in Edmonton and Peace River districts have been victims of these outrages accomplished in peculiarly fiendish abandon. When will the end be? In addition, this was a speech given by an MP, and this was printed in the Edmonton Journal in 1911. It was called We Want No Dark Spots in Alberta. Like the province of British Columbia being called Yellow British Columbia, our own province might be called Black Alberta, and therefore I think the time has come when immigration should be made a subject of personal control. We have our personal rights, but we want not only those that we have got, but also personal rights as to who we want living alongside us and who we do not. There are three classes of people who come to the country. The first class come and intermarry with us, and of course, those are the kind which we want, and in fact, will cry out for them. The second class merely come and do not engage in as much activity as the first class. We cannot say anything against this class and are glad to have them here, but we do not receive them with as much enthusiasm as the others. Then the third class, and here I can refer to Alberta being called Black Alberta. We do not want to have this name attached to us, nor do we want to have the province black in spots. And ultimately it worked. Wilfrid Laurier drafted an order in council that called for black immigration to be banned for 1 year, and his signature was actually on the order of council. They didn't actually go ahead with that. Instead, they used other methods. So for example, doctors were given a bonus for every black person that they denied entry. But of course, there were black people that came here. And Borden Park nowadays is on the east side of Edmonton. But in 1924, it was home to one of the first public swimming pools in Edmonton. It even had a roller coaster in the background. It looks a bit dangerous, but it was there. And when the pool opened, they actually barred black people from swimming in it. So a lot of the families, and they're often led by black women, went to city council and protested this. Negro citizens appealed order barring them from city pool. Oh, this is from the Edmonton Bulletin. Protest is registered and letter forwarded to council. Forbidding races to swim together smacks of Ku Klanism, they say. And this initially worked. City council reversed their decision. But then what happened was a group of white citizens got together and made their own petition. It's over here. We'll ask colored people to refrain from using pools. And their argument was that by allowing black people to swim, they were banning white people. It says here, the allowing of Negroes to use the pools is placing a ban on the great majority of white people that are present using them, as it is inconceivable to me that any white person will go to the pools that are used by colored people, and it is grossly unfair that they should be prohibited from the use of a civic utility by a small minority of our citizens. And City Councilor Joseph Adhere said, "It is not conceivable that any white person, especially a white woman, will use the pools if they are to come into contact with a black man there. It is not a question of superiority of race, but there is a line of distinction between the white and black races that cannot be bridged, and it will be fatal to the success of the pools if the board goes on record as allowing the motion in council to stand." So they listened to these citizens and they re-implemented the ban. But a few months later, 2 black kids wanted to go swimming, and they jumped in the water and all the white people left. And this is the article talking about it. White sleeve bathing pool. 2 Negroes swim in West End baths in white sleeve water. So this brought the discussion back to City Council, and City Council had a meeting, and because it was close to winter, they decided to hold it off for next summer. I went to the city archives and I couldn't actually find if they did discuss it, but at least in the summer of 1924, our public swimming pool, Borden Park, didn't allow black people. In addition, in 1940, there was a race riot in Calgary. Lou Darby, so this is the article talking about it. Soldiers storm House of Negro, police battle men to save besieged musician. So it involved a musician named Lou Darby. This is his family when they came to Canada. That's him on the far left. And this was in 1911 or 1912, and it was in Vulcan, Alberta. You guys know Vulcan, right? Like the Star Trek thing. Cool. So this all started because, Lou Darby, he ran a dance hall, and this all started because one of the soldiers that were there, and this was in the middle of World War II, one of the soldiers that they were there, the person he was with was apparently paying too much attention to a black musician. So you can see here, the girl was reported to have paid too much attention to one of the colored musicians, with the result that the soldier became involved in a fight with one of them. So this was a Saturday. And on the Sunday, he walked into a restaurant where a bunch of white soldiers were eating, and he wanted them to go basically on a rampage. So they first went into a cafe. The mob, voicing threats against nigger joints, formed up in the east end of the city about 6 p.m. and invaded a cafe with the announced intention of wrecking it. City police managed to persuade them to leave. So at this point, there's about a couple hundred Canadian soldiers, and they moved through Harlem town, and they moved through and they moved towards Lou Darby's home. And when they got there, they found a white soldier. Now, for context, this soldier married Lou Darby's sister, and when the soldiers saw that, they were outraged. So they actually stripped him of his uniform. Well, I guess so. They broke the window, they destroyed the fence, and they actually ran through the door. And they saw the soldier, took off his uniform, and he was being assaulted. And then the police showed up. So yeah, you can see here. It later transpired, however, that Lizek and the woman had been married on March 26 with the consent of his commanding officer. And Lou Darby was hiding in his house with a butcher knife, and he said he was ready to use it, but he was being escorted out by the police when the crowd yelled, "Get him!" And they rushed him, but the police managed to beat back the soldiers. Darby was hustled out, and the mob opened a path for them, but just as the party was halfway to the police car, someone yelled, "Get him!" and a mix-up followed. And one of the soldiers actually threw a rock at one of the police inspectors. And the soldiers, they wanted to keep rampaging. So a squad of military police had succeeded in dispersing the crowd around the Darby residence. The soldiers and civilians trampled back to the center of the city, where they threatened to raid more nigger joints. But they were dissuaded by one of their officers, and the officer marched them to the barracks, and a few blocks away from the barracks, he let them go. And the army the next day said that there would be an inquiry. So they held an inquiry, and they arrested one soldier. Now, the thing is, I can't actually find any coverage about what happened, and I can't actually find a record of the actual inquiry. I tried looking at the National Archives, but I couldn't find anything. So I don't actually know what happened with the inquiry. What I do know is that a bunch of the other soldiers were able to get off and face no consequences. So this was in 1940. So that happened, and I think this is kind of relevant considering our prime minister, but minstrel shows are very common in Canada. If you don't know, minstrel shows are when white people put on blackface and make fun of black people. One popular minstrel show was Jump Jim Crow. It mocked a physically disabled black slave, and it's actually where the term Jim Crow laws comes from. And Childish Gambino kind of plays on these themes in some of his music. So this is the old new Enbridge building, and there's two buildings built into it. One of them is the Ramsey Building, named after James Ramsey. He was an MLA, a businessman, and he was also a minstrel performer. I know this because this is from the Edmonton Bulletin. The article on the left is talking about a minstrel parade, and it says, James Ramsey made a good a nigger as there was in the parade. If you go in front of this building, they have this whole display with a biography about his life, but this is not mentioned anywhere in there. As a matter of fact, when we talk about minstrel shows, we often think of them as American things, but minstrel shows have been in Canada, recorded since 1841, and blackface has continued. In fact, the person who created the melody for O Canada, this guy, he was a minstrel performer. So you can say that minstrel shows are as old as O Canada. So these are some photos of some Alberta minstrel performers. On the left is Mayor William Henry in 1917. He's in blackface. This is the Kiwanis Club Minstrel Show, Edmonton, 1935. Rotary Minstrel Show, Calgary, 1919. Rotary Minstrels, Edmonton, 1921. Minstrel Show at Empire Theatre, Drumheller, Alberta, 1945. And this stuff hasn't ended. This was just last year where a teacher in Sherwood Park wore blackface for a Halloween thing. And just a few weeks ago, our prime minister had photos uncovered of him. Actually, just a week ago, the fire chief for St. Albert, I don't know if you saw the news, the photos of him in blackface were uncovered, but from 2017. So here you have Gibson Block. It's a very iconic building. Right now it's a women's shelter, but back in the day it was a cafe. And it also had some rooms you could rent. If you look at the back of the building, you notice that there's a few prominent advertisements. So you can see Pepsi and you can see the Edmonton Journal. But then you see a white box. And I always wondered what was in that white box. And if you look at some like older photos, you see that there was something there. And like I went down this huge rabbit hole, I couldn't really find much about the image, and some guy on Flickr had the like plans of the building with the advertisements drawn on the back. And this is what it said: Gibson Cafe, open all night, best service, friendly people, white help only. So we literally whitewashed one part of our history that we don't like, and we kept the part that we want. So this is downtown Edmonton. On the right is the Macleod Building, and this is how the street looked way back in the day. If you ever wondered what that clock tower is over there, that's the clock tower for the old post office. So fun fact, now you can tell people. Behind the post office was where the KKK had their headquarters in Edmonton. The Alberta clan was based in Edmonton, and they were on Jasper Ave. This guy, J.J. Maloney, he was the head of the Alberta clan, and this guy wanted this guy to be mayor of Edmonton, Daniel Knott, and they succeeded. In 1931, Daniel Knott became mayor of Edmonton. And to celebrate, they burned a cross on Connors Hill. And when they were in office, they wrote letters to each other. So this is from the City of Edmonton archives. Gentlemen, the Ku Klux Klan will hold a convention in the City of Edmonton August 6 to 8 inclusive, and as part of the proceedings will hold a demonstration on August 8, at which, among other features of the program, an open-air initiation will be held, during the course of which a fiery cross will be burned. And so this happened at, so the exhibition grounds is kind of where Northlands is now. So if you take the LRT, it's by Coliseum Station. And they went back and forth. So this was the fire chief, and he said, while not interested in the Klan or its doings, yet as fire chief, I think it is right to call attention to the danger of any fire being lit on the exhibition grounds. It is contrary to the city bylaws, and in the event of there being a high wind, the danger of fire would be very great. And as you know, the exhibition buildings are frame structures, thus increasing the hazard. So Daniel Knott, he replied, and he approved the cross burning on one condition. This permit is granted on the understanding that no smoking will be allowed. And then he signed, hoping that this is satisfactory to UIM. Yours truly, Daniel K. Knott, Mayor. So Daniel Knott, his portrait is one step outside the mayor's office. He has a junior high named after him on the south side. For some reason, their logo is a dragon. I don't understand. Well, I guess the fire thing, maybe. And J.J. Maloney, he continued recruiting. So Maloney would hold what he called free speech specials. So this is him in downtown Edmonton, Maloney Free Speech Special. That may remind you of a few people who use that. But yeah, he used that to recruit, and he was successful. He claimed to have thousands of members, and he claimed that their paper, The Liberator, which I've been unable to find a copy of, but he claimed that paper had a circulation of 250,000. He was probably exaggerating, but that's what he claimed. And if you look at this photo, it's a photo of a Klan gathering. You can see they're holding up copies of the paper. And if you look very closely, you see that it reads, well, you can't see it that well, but maybe on your computer you can see it. It says, free speech is upheld. By the way, when we think of the Klan, in general, we often think of like big, scary men in like hoods and everything. But the reality is, this is how the Klan looked like in Edmonton at the height of the power in the 1930s. And you wonder what impact this had on the black people who lived here. So I went to the Edmonton Public School Board archives, and I just looked for photos of black students. And I came across a few. Most of the time, the black person, or a lot of the time, the black person would be in the front row center of these photos. And this photo stood out to me. It was the Edmonton Technical School grade 8 class, I think in 31 or 32. So the year where a Klan supporter was in the mayor's office. And you could see everyone else is kind of dressed okay, but in the front row center, there's one black student. He has one button done up. You can see his bare skin, and he's kind of in an awkward posture. And I was curious about the class, and in the yearbook, classmates could write a sentence about each other. And one of the sentences read, Stanley Petherbridge was walking down the street with The Birth of a Nation behind him. If you don't know, Birth of a Nation was a 1915 film that glorified the KKK. It's actually one of the most famous films in American film history. And The Birth of a Nation was shown here, and it's shown across Canada. So this is a review of Birth of a Nation when it was shown in Edmonton. The Birth of a Nation is a marvelous production. Wonderful moving picture drama is crowded with thrills that held capacity audience at Empire Theatre spellbound last night. 30-piece orchestra adds greatly to effect. And the Klan didn't go away. Like the height of the power was in the 20s and 30s, but the Klan as a legal entity existed. So for some context, I was on Stormfront. Do you guys know? It's a terrible place. Don't go on it. But it's like where all the white nationalists go. And I was just reading one of the forums, and somebody was talking about the Klan and how it's still certified. And back then I was working in the province, so I called Service Alberta, and I gave them the incorporation number. And they said, yeah, the Klan was certified until 2003. And they only lost their status because in 2001, they stopped filing financial documents. So this is the Certificate of Incorporation, Invisible Empire Association of Alberta, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And you can see in the bottom right, there's the Alberta government logo there. And it's funny, like we kept talking on the phone, and eventually they asked if I wanted to reincorporate them. So that happened. Fun fact, so Invisible Empire often goes with the full name of the Klan. Invisible Empire comes from when they would meet with like American politicians, and the politicians would say, we can't support you publicly, we have to be invisible. So their power doesn't only come from people in hoods, but it comes from the silent support of the general public and people in power. Despite all this, though, there's resistance. Pictured here is Violet King. She's the first black lawyer in Alberta, the first black woman to be a lawyer in Canada, and she graduated from the U of A Law School in 1954. So Pembina Hall, now it's where the Faculty of Native Studies is, but it's where it used to be a women's residence back in the day, and Violet King was the head of the women's residence at the U of A in the 50s. And so this is from the Gateway. How many people here know who Peter Lougheed is? So when Peter Lougheed was president of the Students' Union, Violet King was vice president of the Students' Union. And you can see Peter Lougheed on the right of those photos. And she did some like really interesting things. Apparently it was a thing for like drunk men to play bagpipes and like terrorize campus. And that was happening, and they were going to Pembina Hall, and she stopped them. Reaching Pembina Hall in much diminished numbers, they entered the southeast and northeast doors, where they were met by Vi King, House Committee Chairwoman. When questioned at the preliminary hearings of any difficulty encountered as she met the boys, Vi answered, I said, let's get out, fellas, and they left. So she became a lawyer. She would give speeches about how women and black people still need legal protections. And she later moved to Ottawa, where she worked for Citizenship Canada. So this is a photo of her on the Pembina House Committee. She's on the right. That's a photo of her in the Arts and Science Club. So this is the old Enbridge building, but back in the day, in 1922, it was a theater. It was called the Metropolitan. It also went by the Pantages Theater. And in 1922, Lulu Anderson, a black woman, went to purchase a ticket to a show, and she was refused entry. She was actually she was thrown out of the theater. So she sued the theater, and she actually lost her case. On the left is from the Winnipeg Free Press. Alberta courts have decided that a colored woman has no legal redress if a theater refuses her admission, even though she holds a ticket for a reserved seat. Judge Dubois in a recent Edmonton case, by the way, Judge Dubois has a statue of him overlooking the river valley. Judge Dubois in a recent Edmonton case held that management of a theater could refuse admission to anyone upon tendering the price of the ticket, in view of the reservation printed on all the tickets that such refusal can be exercised at the option of the management. Miss Lulu Anderson sued a local theater for damages because she was refused entry because she was colored. So I wanted to know more about her case. So I went to the provincial archives, and it turns out her case was actually destroyed. In 1971, the government had a policy, or they met and they decided that for a certain set of years, they would destroy they would destroy records and only keep a specimen for each year, and hers didn't exist. I'm sure it's somewhere, but I've been unable to come across it. But I wanted to know more about her. So I went on Ancestry.com and I found this immigration slip. And you can see that she lived kind of near where Boyle Street is now. She was 37 in 1923, so she could have been 36 when this case happened. And I wanted to find a photo of her. So using the Peel Prairie Archive, I don't know if you know that, it's like a digitized newspaper record. It's kind of awkward to search because you can only search one word at a time. So you have to You have to type in a word, and then you have to like specify with like another word and like keep going deeper. But they had access to a publication that talked about Black citizens that were actually written by Black Edmontonians. And I scanned through all of those, and I found that she was active in the choir, and active in the choir of the Emmanuel AME Baptist Church. And I came across this photo by chance from the Glenbow archives, and this is the Emmanuel AME Baptist Church in 1921. So about the year when she was active, or about the time when she was active. So it's very likely she's in this photo somewhere, but I don't actually know who she is. And it's bittersweet for two reasons. The first reason is when we think about American civil rights, we think of images. We think of Rosa Parks sitting on the bus. We think of water fountains for Black and white people. But in Edmonton, in Canada, a lot of those same things happened here. But for some reason or another, we don't have those images. So that's why it was bitter. But it was also nice because you saw that she had a community behind her. When she launched this court case and eventually lost, she wasn't alone. And here's the thing, this is not isolated. The same thing happened in Calgary in 1914. A Black man named Charles Daniels went to the Sherman Grand Theatre, and he went to purchase a ticket to see King Lear. And when he walked in, he was refused entry. So this is Peter Lougheed. I mentioned him before. His father, I think grandfather, was this guy, Senator Lougheed. So he owned the Grand Theatre. And this is the article talking about the case from the Calgary Herald. Calgary nigger kicks up fuss, wants to attend theatre with white folk, but management say no. And the weird thing about this case is 1914, 30 years before Viola Desmond, 40 years before Rosa Parks, Charles Daniels won his case in Calgary. But he kind of won for a weird reason. It was the start of World War I, and the theatre management didn't show up to court. So he won $1,000 by default. So this is from the first article. The theatre would fight the case to the last on the ground that it was the privilege of the management to exclude any person they regarded as undesirable or likely to injure their business. This is from the article on the right. This is the first ever case of the kind which has ever come before the courts of the city and has excited widespread interest. Daniels based his action on the contention that the theatre was a public place, and as he was sober and well-behaved, he had the privilege to occupy any seat in the house, which he was willing to buy at the regular rate. And his case exists for some reason, and I got access to it. I had 2 hours of examination, 2 hours with Sherman, who was the guy who actually ran the theatre, and 1 hour with Charles. So this is from the examination. So they're asked if this would humiliate Daniel, and Sherman says, "It would humiliate him, but a man in his position in public life, as he says he is, ought to know what a position I am in. If a man goes to a theatre with his wife, and next to his wife he saw a colored man, his wife would not want to sit there." MacDonald, "Yes, but we were going on to something else." Sherman, "Oh, sometimes white people make a kick as anyone else. Sometimes our friends are not our friends, and I am sure we have never done anything to humiliate anyone." So the Grand Theatre still exists. After I wrote an article about it, it kind of blew up a bit. They reached out, and they're interested in like finding ways to honor Charles. But it's interesting. Viola Desmond did the same thing, and she's on our $10 bill. But as Albertans, we don't know about Charles or Lulu or Ted King. I don't have time to talk about his case, but he launched a civil rights case in 1959. You can Google Ted King, Calgary, if you want to read more. And so that's where the City of Edmonton archives is, and behind it is the Royal Alex, which is one of the hospitals in Edmonton. And in 1938, a Black woman wanted to be a nurse. So she applied for nursing training there, and she was refused. This is from an op-ed a few years after talking about it. "I have been in another country for the past 2 weeks. They have a racial problem about the handling of which Canadians can wax righteously indigent. Sheer hypocrisy, most of it. We talk about racial equality, and when it gets down to cases, we react just the same as the very people we condemn. A very fine Negro girl made application to train as a nurse in our publicly owned hospital in Edmonton a few years ago. She was at first accepted because there's no excuse not to accept her. She had every qualification and she greatly wanted to be a nurse. And then our boasted Canadian racial tolerance came to trial and failed miserably. Because she was colored, the girl was denied the right to the career she longed to enter. Question, might have she been better off under the segregation employed in the southern states? At least there she could have become a nurse, trained in a Negro hospital. We denied her that chance. So I was really curious about this. So I went to the city archives and I picked up the minutes for the Edmonton Hospital Board because I wanted to see if this was recorded anywhere. And I came across this motion after looking through 2,000 pages. I came across this little thing. I came across it. I don't know how I stayed awake, but I did. But you see Margaret Crang, who was one of the first women on city council, she put a motion forward to actually reverse this policy. Ms. Crang moved that the board approve of the principle of admission to the Nurses Training School of Girls irrespective of race or color, provided they meet the cultural, educational, physical requirements. So she put that motion forward, and the chair ruled that it was out of order. And the chair's ruling was sustained. So the motion actually failed. And when you look at the legacy of this, the legacy of policies like that, if you look at the graduating photos of U of A nursing students, you don't really see a black face up until the 70s or 80s. And this is a result of policies like that. So I say that because the stuff isn't new. All the stuff I mentioned, a response I usually get is, oh, it was 100 years ago, it was a long time ago, why are you still talking about it? A lot of this stuff hasn't gone away. This is a photo of a cross burning in Provost, Alberta in 1990. Hate groups still exist in Edmonton. They have dinner at the Boston Pizza on White Ave some weekends. They're very active. In addition, the way we talk about asylum seekers, the way we talk about some classes of immigrants are different from others. This is the Globe and Mail talking about, in 2017, when there was a large wave of asylum seekers. They said tens of thousands have flooded the Canada-U.S. border. For context, I think it was 50,000 asylum seekers came to Canada in that year. That's one day in Bangladesh during the height of the Rohingya refugee crisis. So when we talk about flooding and all that, we really got to put that in perspective. So this is talking about 2017. This is an article talking about the wave of black immigration, and it says how Edmonton district was being inundated with a flood of blacks. So very similar language. In addition, hate groups like the Soldiers of Odin, they actually changed their name to the Klan with a C instead of a K. I know. They follow a history of Alberta hate groups. In addition, this narrative about some people coming here free. This is from that early time, free entrance for the black man. But if many more come here to Homestead, some action will be taken. And this was tweeted out by Andrew Scheer last year. And it's a photo of a black man crossing into Canada. And he later deleted the tweet and apologized. You can see it's very similar. In addition, the whole free speech thing, that could be a lecture by itself. But you saw figures like Faith Goldie, a white nationalist, someone who promotes the Great Conspiracy Theory, a theory that led to the Christchurch shooter, killing 50 people. She was able to speak on campuses by relying on this whole free speech thing. And in the 80s, at the U of T, students organized to actually oppose the Klan from being on campus. And the executive assistant to the Attorney General of Ontario, Michael, said the Klan had the right to free speech, but would be watched very carefully. And Gary Yee was one of the organizers against the Klan. Gary Yee of the Student Council Anti-Racism Committee rejects the freedom of speech argument. It may be easier for those who have not been subjected to racism, to speak for rights of speech. So it's the same old conversation. So I want to close a little bit with this James Baldwin quote about history. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. In great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history which has placed one where one is and formed one's point of view. In great pain and terror, because therefore one enters into battle with that historic creation, oneself, and attempts to recreate oneself according to a principle more humane and more liberating. One begins the attempt to achieve a level of personal maturity and freedom which robs history of its tyrannical power, but also changes history. So when you walk through Edmonton, for those out of town in your last few days, and those in Edmonton, when you walk through the city and look at these locations, think about where you are. Think about what happened here. And when you see something in the news, don't think that this is in Edmonton, because it is. This is our city. Thank you. So if you can, yeah, we have some time. If you can, just like spend a couple minutes and reflect on what you saw, and then I guess Q&A. Cool.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I can, yeah, we'll wait a minute, and then I'll help moderate questions for you.
Cool. So just talk to each other. They're very shy. Oh, we'll go to questions after we're done talking. Oh, no worries. You're very shy. You should speak more.
As you like.
I thought I went a little over, but. Yeah, like usually, because I find otherwise if there's like just a hard end, people just kind of leave with like a lot, like to think about. I think it's always better if like they just release it a little bit, even if they're like a little shy. Yeah, yeah. So after this is just the closing. Okay, cool. Should be sweet. Yeah, I'll stick around for a bit. My only plan today was just go to the gym after and then run around. Okay. But it's open until 10. The gym, the YMCA. Oh, okay. So there's a lot of. I don't think the closing will take that long. Maybe another minute, or another maybe 30 seconds. I hope the sources were clear. Did I mention like? I always forget to mention where I got certain stuff. Did I do that a bit?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the sources.
Okay. Well, I saw some people laughing when I was explaining the search for the Peel Current.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's because that's a U of A.
Yeah, yeah. I think I saw, yeah, the U of A people were laughing.
Yeah, that's
funny.
I mean, it's like you want feedback, so like something's bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't roasting. It was just a funny method because, like, instead of searching, sentence,
Okay, so I think we're ready now to have a discussion, take some questions, and so I guess I would invite anyone who has questions to come up to the mic. And maybe while folks are thinking about their questions, I can ask you one about. I mean, so much to take in from your presentation, and to tie it back, I think, to maybe some of the themes that we've seen this week. One of the things that kind of came up in different ways, but was kind of images versus words and text, and you had both of those in the research that you've done, and they both can carry a lot of weight in terms of communicating, presenting something that is not what we think of as, let's say, Canada, right? Yeah. So I'm just wondering, but then you also talked about the fact that sometimes we don't have images for important things, and so I'm just wondering your thoughts about whether you think that images or words have more kind of affective weight in terms of communicating something to people today. Does one or the other, or how do you think about those two, and maybe how they go together?
Yeah, I think so. I mostly share a lot of this like on Twitter, or like sometimes I'll write an article about it. And the reason why I keep it so image focused is that it makes it more real for people. So for example, imagine this presentation without images. Imagine if I just told you the Klan was here, or I just told you that they had cross burnings. But by then showing like meetings of the Klan, but also showing, so this is where I think documents are important. So also showing a Klan letter with letterhead from the Alberta chapter of the KKK, that also makes it more real. The other thing I like to do is like heavily, like just make it relevant to now. So the reason why I showed like where things are now is because it just also makes it more real for people. Like you notice I kept name dropping locations like Connors Hill, Northlands, Coliseum, Jasper. And the reason I do that is it makes it more real for people. And I've actually done like this same thing to a class of like grade 6 students, and they all understood. And it was because I think there's that connection. Yeah.
Okay, I see some movement out there on the floor.
We have like 25 minutes, so
we've got
go
lots of time.
Or 20 minutes. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Bashir. I follow you on Twitter, so I've seen you kind of dig into some of this stuff before, but it was really powerful to see it kind of all put together in one lecture. The question I have is, in our profession, there's often a feeling that the historical record is something that we find almost in nature, and that it's up to us to kind of preserve it in the form that we find it in. But one of the things that is clear when you're talking about this is that we get the historical record already manipulated and already packaged. So that the Gibson block is a good example of that we find that already whitewashed. So when you're working in archives, how do you approach the idea that we might have in the profession of the archive as a neutral site, right? Because it's not a neutral site, and so you when you're working through it, what goes through your head when you're working with that material?
Yeah, can I answer that with a quote?
Sure.
Okay. Does anyone know who? Can you hear me? Does anyone know who John Hope Hamilton is? I will show you. So he was a black archivist. John Hope Hamilton, archivist. Sorry, Franklin. I'm really bad. I was thinking of Franklin, archivist. Here it is. If you can, I would recommend reading this article, Archiving While Black. And he said, so the first time he went, okay, I'll just read this out. The experience of archiving while black, perhaps best captured by famed African-American historian John Hope Franklin, a native of Oklahoma who came of age during Jim Crow. Franklin experienced a series of formative racist incidents that led him to pursue a career in history. In his 1963 essay, The Dilemma of the American Negro Scholar, he described his efforts to view collections at an archive in North Carolina. Franklin recalled, "My arrival created a panic and emergency among the administrators that was itself an incident of historic proportions. The archivist frankly informed me that I was the first Negro who had sought to use the facilities there, and as the architect who designed the building had not anticipated such a situation, my use of manuscripts and other materials would have to be postponed for several days, during which time one of the exhibition rooms would be converted to a reading room. It was never assumed that a black person would, in Franklin's words, have the capacity to use the materials there. The issue of capacity was an index of the racist ideas at the time. At the core of the claim and the alarm over his physical presence in the archives was the fact that neither architect or archivist had conceived of black people as intellectuals who inhabit such scholarly spaces." And the reason why I point that out is because a lot of people think this stuff hasn't happened here. It's often really hard to explain what I'm actually looking for. It's like when I went to the provincial archives and I was explaining like my research interest, why I was interested in like this specific thing, there was some confusion. So, I don't know, I think in terms of like what archivists can do, especially about this particular example, like Black history, is just to be aware of it. The other thing too is when I showed up, is anyone here from the provincial archives? No, okay, I'll speak frank. So when I first showed up, like, yeah, it was really intense. And yeah, there was just like a lot of questions about who I was. Am I an historian? Am I an academic? You know, am I this or that? And it was interesting. Like, there was a brief encounter for like 10 seconds, but it's kind of hard to get past. I'm just a random person here. And it's funny, they later had like a photo shoot thing. And I was there looking at materials. And yeah, they asked me to be in their like diversity thing. So there's, and I mean, I was fine with it. Like, they're nice people, but like those stories are, you know, some examples of some of these challenges. Also, like the archives, I didn't know anyone could actually go to it. You know what I mean? I didn't know it was a public place. Same thing with libraries, like academic libraries. Like, I don't know that I could just walk in and request something, you know? Sorry, it's kind of like but I would recommend reading John Hope Franklin's essay and just Google him if you want to know more about that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, another question?
Hello, mine is more a comment, not really a question, but just to underline that history is really present, and I think that your speech should be listened by, by the younger generation. I'm from Italy, and we have boats coming from Africa each day, and there is unfortunately a right wind that is creating a hate culture, and we really never learn enough from history, I think. And so thank you for your talk.
Nice, I agree.
Hi, I'm from the University of Alberta, and I work on the Pillsbury Province's site.
Thank you.
And I want to talk to you about multi-word searches at some point. But it's been a thrill to see the use you've made of it, following you on Twitter and some of your other writings, to see that what we did in digitizing that stuff enables the work that you've done and the teaching that you're doing. Earlier today, we had another talk dealing with the digitization of materials from Black history, the slave narratives from the US in the 30s, digitized by Library of Congress. And Kate, who spoke for that, touched on a code of ethics she'd picked up from, we know about that talked about a number of ways, things you have to engage with when you're going to do that kind of historical digitization of charged material. And what stood out for me was the section she pointed to that said, think about the terrible people. Think about how the stuff you're putting out there might be used by a white supremacist group, but all the different kinds of terrible people. And the stuff that we put out there that you've made use of is also available to them. And I haven't looked to see whether it's been tapped into or used, and I would I'm kind of afraid to. Do you have any thoughts about the way we do this work that we should hear, that we should pay attention to as we move forward with this?
Yeah, I think on that first point, I think just having the information public is good. I think it doesn't really matter if like a white supremacist or whoever has access to it, because oddly enough, they're the ones who knew more about the Klan like before all this stuff was actually like they were the ones who guided me to actually seeing that it was. I didn't actually talk to them, but like I went on their forum, so they already have an understanding of Canada's racist history. In many ways, they're more of an expert than me. So I think having that information public and free is good. Like at Peel Prairie, anyone can log into it, but some newspapers are missing. Like the Edmonton Journal is on newspapers.com. And I have to pay every month, I think, like $20 or something to get access to it. I'm not sure how that politics works, why the Journal picked that website to do it, but because it's on newspapers.com, I have to use a paywall to access it. And I can't even go through the library, actually. I can't go through the Edmonton Public Library to get access to newspapers.com. So maybe as librarians, academic librarians, I don't know if they offer like institutional like logins, but I think the number one thing is going forward, like just my humble recommendation would be making it as public as possible. For example, I actually don't mind searching by one word because it's free. I consider that like my tax, for it. But you can search multi-word, but you get like the results are like a bit different. But anyways, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really very enlightening talk, and for me, it was very beneficial to see how this. I'm very familiar with the U.S. history of it, but to see how it's played out here was very enlightening. One thing that you said really kind of put a bug in my head that I was thinking about. You were noting when you were trying to find the lawsuit of the woman who tried to sue the theater because she was denied entry, and you couldn't find her case file, but it was because there had apparently been a period where they were, I want to make sure I understood this right, that they were saving sample files from each year. And that really struck out at me because in the world, in the archives world, there's been a lot of discourse and changes in the way that archivists approach how we select what we save, right? We call this appraisal. And so for a long time, there was this idea that just the volume of government records is so massive that, you run out of space, and if government's not willing to pay for storage and archivists to manage everything, you can only keep so much. And so there was this ideology, and I'm wondering, this might have been what happened, of sampling, where you would sort of take a few representative types of the record from that period, but not everything, and save it. And so this is really making me reconceive of the idea of sampling, because this would have been a great thing for you to have access to. And I guess from your perspective as a user of archives, what is your thought on when we are confronted with these situations where we don't have enough funding for both storage and staffing, what sort of criteria should we be keeping in mind when we are forced into scenarios where we have to do something like sampling?
Yeah, I think, not speak as archivist or librarian, my personal opinion is that everything should be kept, but that leads to I think at the end of the day, it's a political problem. I don't think there should be that choice. And for context, I think the reason why they were destroyed in 1971, for some Alberta context, that was the change in government from the social credit to the PCs. So if you don't know, the social credit were a pretty wild party. Their idea was we would print money and just give it to people and get rid of social. Anyways, so they did that. Oh, they also passed the Accurate Information Act, and I think in the 30s or something, that said that for any article about the government, they could publish a rebuttal. And the lieutenant governor refused to give it royal assent, so they took away his house, his driver, and that's why Government House, he doesn't live there anymore. Fun fact. And also the Edmonton Journal won a what's the name of the big? Yeah, yeah. They won that big journalism award. But I digress. In 1971 is when there was a change of government, and I think what happened was it was a committee, it was a political committee, and that's where they made that decision. And I mention that because I don't know how political this conference is, but like, yeah, yeah. There's ways to mobilize. I assume like you have unions and everything. Like putting political pressure and showing the importance of these institutions, I think is major, and that's something I try to do every single day. Provincial politicians are paying attention. Black history, the stuff I talked about, was in the curriculum review. I've noticed even UCP politicians talking about Charles Daniel. So there is opportunity, and in many ways, sometimes you have to shame them. I don't have an answer of how that'll be done, but in my personal opinion, I don't think it should ever get down to like what should we save and what should we get rid of. You know what I mean? But I'm not an archivist or a librarian, so listen to someone smarter, and then you can get it.
Hi, thanks very much, Bashir. So you mentioned the Make It Awkward campaign, and obviously you being here today and pointing out these landmarks around us that are often white men preserved all around the city that we take for granted all around us. I guess maybe to pick up on what you were just saying as a previous answer, what are some, so you're performing some rhetorical power. What would you like to see in Edmonton and maybe every Canadian city in terms of the goals of, is it, representation, visibility? Is it public service campaigns, curriculum, integration? What would you like to happen in order to be truly just and kind of in line with the values that we purport that we have in Canada?
Yeah, I think we need like really serious political change. Like if you look at Edmonton, Edmonton has never had a black municipal politician. We've never had a black person elected to city council. We've never had a black person elected to the school board or the public school board. And I think that's why a lot of this stuff wasn't saved. Like the people making the decisions back then didn't see this as relevant. So I think at the end of the day, like that's where it needs to ultimately come from. The other thing is like conferences like these. Like I was kind of surprised to get an invite here. Like I'm 24. I'm like pretty young, so I was surprised to like get an invite to give a keynote. But taking a risk like that of like wanting to know about this history, I think is really big. And at the end of the day, it reminds me of the story of like this mom was putting her child to bed. And the child asked the mom, is it true that the lion is the king of the jungle? And the mom said, yes, that's true. Then the daughter said, then how come in every story where the man fights a lion, the man wins? And the mom thought about it for a bit and said, that's because the lion hasn't written its own stories. And I think at the end of the day, that's where a lot of this change will come from. And hopefully you all leave today doing small work in your everyday jobs to make Edmonton and Canada more just. Thanks for the question.
Any more questions?
You're all tired? I could go home.
It's not necessarily related directly to your talk, but I have heard you speak before, and I really enjoy listening to your perspectives and your research. And I was just curious to know what you're going to do in the future. Like, do you plan to write books? Where do you want to go? Because as librarians and archivists, we definitely want to collect the things that you publish.
Thank you. So almost everything I mentioned, I've either written for like a publication or it's like somewhere on Twitter. You have to sort through the memes to actually find that stuff. But in terms of like where I want to go, so I guess to give context, like I grew up in Edmonton. Like my dad passed away when I was young, and my mom was out of the house a lot, so I had to like grow up really quick. So I entered university. I like focused as much as I could, worked in the province, and to be honest, it really drained me. Like up until this month, especially to be political. With working in this provincial government was really difficult for me, and that's why I actually resigned from the province. So in terms of what I want to do, like I'm still going to be drawn to this stuff. I don't know if I'll be doing much more research like this. Like people reach out to me, they have problems, and because of like the stuff I write about, they think I can help them. So I'll probably keep doing that. For example, a few weeks ago, a black mom, her son, a junior high student, was wearing a do-rag to school. And the constable, the school resource officer, comes up to him and asks him why he's wearing a do-rag, because he said it was affiliated with a gang. And then he asked the kid if he's affiliated with a gang. Mom, obviously upset, goes to a school meeting. The meeting lasts 6 minutes, and they ban her from the school for about a year. You're going to hear about this in a few weeks. It's going to come out there. Yeah, so stuff like that is going to keep me preoccupied. And I think just because it's necessary. I see myself in a lot of, those shoes, especially that kid. It was mentioned that I'm going to go in the Naval Reserve. That's just something I wanted to do. I always wanted to learn a hard skill. As a matter of fact, when I was a kid, I actually always wanted to be an astronaut. And what I like about navigation and all that stuff is you can be in the middle of the ocean, and just by having clear skies and using stars and the horizon, you can tell exactly where you are in the world. So I find that stuff really interesting. So I want to do that. Basically, I want to mature for a bit. I consider my 20s to be my training. And then when I come back, I feel like maybe I'll write a book. But right now, I don't feel like I have that much to say. But I'll still be around. I'll be floating around. You may see me around. I don't know. Yeah.
Great. Well, maybe we will end it on that note. I just want to thank you again for giving us just an extraordinary talk to end our conference this week. And would you all please join me in thanking Bashir?